Wonderful to be back with you. For those of us who joined us for our symposium back in 2021, it's been a while since we've done some of these sessions, and certainly a lot has happened in the world since 2021. But really thrilled to be having these symposium sessions in the next couple of months. I'm Larry Edelson. I am the founder and the artistic and general director of American Lyric Theater. And we're so happy to have you here for our 2024 symposium sessions, starting with Pathways to Opera for Librettists. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to thank the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the Mellon Foundation, the Dubose and Dorothy Heyward Memorial Trust, the Howard Gilman Foundation, the Amphion Foundation, the Aaron Copland Fund for Music, and the Ditson Foundation for their support of our free programs to provide resources for opera composers and librettists, as well as opera dramaturgs. We're also deeply grateful to all of our individual donors who have made a personal investment in our programs. So thank you to everyone. We can't do what we do without your support. Now we turn to our discussion this evening with four really fantastic librettists. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to acknowledge that part of the purpose of this session is to encourage applications for ALT's Composer Librettist Development Program. So we will be talking a bit about the CLDP, but our discussion this evening is really meant to focus on encouraging artists from a wide variety of backgrounds to tell their stories through opera. So with that in mind, we've invited four artists to join us who have had very different journeys to the opera stage. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, and then we will dive into our discussion. We do have a Q&A set up, and so if you have any questions that come up along the way, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring them. We will likely save the majority of the questions for the end of the session, but do put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat. It's just easier for us to find them that way. All right. So let's get started. Deborah Brevoort is our first panelist. Deborah, if you would turn your camera on. Deborah is an alum of the very first cohort of the CLDP at ALT, a successful playwright and lyricist before turning her talents to opera. Deborah has written 10 opera libretti and recently was the winner of the Campbell Opera Librettist Prize sponsored by Opera America. She teaches both at NYU and Columbia and is the co-chair with Michael Korie of the Opera Committee at the Dramatists Guild. Our next panelist is Deborah D.E.P. Mouton. And Deborah, we're gonna go by Deborah's nickname D.E.P. so we don't get the Deborahs confused today. D.E.P. is an alum of the most recent cohort of the CLDP at ALT. D.E.P. is a writer, activist, performer, and the Poet Laureate Emeritus of Houston. D.E.P. is currently finishing her residency at ALT as she completes her collaboration with Jasmine Barnes on She Who Dared, which will premiere in 2025 at a company to be announced very shortly. And she's joining us today from St. Louis, where she and Jasmine are participating in Opera Theater of St. Louis's New Works Collective, which we'll also talk about today. So welcome, D.E.P. Our next panelist is Michael Korie. I'm sure many of you know Michael's work. Michael is a guest mentor on the faculty of the CLDP. Michael originally studied music, and something I didn't know until recently, transferred to study journalism and went on to write and edit for publications, including The Village Voice, before making his mark as a lyricist on and off Broadway, as well as a librettist in the Opera House. And of course, he is co-chair with Deborah of the Opera Committee at the Dramatists Guild. And we'll be talking about opportunities and resources at the Dramatists Guild and what the Dramatists Guild has been doing lately to advocate for librettists in the opera field as well. And last but not least, John de los Santos. John is a dynamic stage director and choreographer who has worked in opera, musical theater, concert, dance, and he is increasingly in demand as a librettist. And while he is not an alum of the CLDP, he has worked closely with our founding faculty member, Korie Edelson, and collaborates frequently with one of our alum, Clint Borzoni, composer Clint Borzoni. So John, we're really happy to have you with us as well today.
Thanks for having me.
So my introductions are really just the tip of the iceberg. And I'd love to start by asking each of you what you were doing, where you were focusing your creative energy before pursuing libretto writing, and what was your journey to becoming an opera librettist. And Deborah, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. Well, I had a very long journey to get to the opera. I lived for many years in Alaska and was an original company member with the Perseverance Theater in Juneau. But I think that those early years in Alaska really sort of sort of put me on the path to opera, even though I didn't realize it at the time. We were making theater on the lip of the void in a state that had 55 languages and cultures and incredibly diverse performing traditions. So I sort of cut my teeth on theater that was really not based in realism or naturalism, and so sort of developed a real appetite for, or an aesthetic that would I guess you would call more theatrical or stylistic. Um, when I left Alaska, I studied with Paula Vogel. And if there's any playwrights out there, you know that she's a formalist. And I really, again, it was many experiments with form, again, veering towards something very stylistic and sort of hyper theatrical. And I think it really started for me when I wrote a no drama about Elvis Presley, and it was my first encounter working with music. And I suddenly experienced what it was like to have my words marry music and be able to fly to someplace higher and deeper than they had without music. And that really sort of set me on the path to working with music. I ended up going to the NYU Graduate Musical Theater Writing Program. I was studying opera. I even based the finale of my NYU thesis musical on the marriage of Figaro. But I mean, I was really slow to get it. I didn't get the memo that opera was something you could do, and it just never occurred to me to write opera. And then I wrote a play called The Women of Lockerbie, which is based, again, very formal. It's a Greek tragedy. And it occurred to me that it needed to be an opera. And I started getting offers from people, to composers, to collaborate to make it an opera. And I had the good sense to say no, because I realized, oh, I think before I turn this into an opera, I need to learn something. And as fate would have it, this thing came over the transom called American Lyric Theater Composer Librettist Development Program, and I applied for it with the goal to get the skills to be able to do that. And it completely changed my life and put me on the path to opera. And I just wonder, like, what took me so long and why I didn't get there sooner, but I did get there. And it's kind of now where I'm dedicating most of my creative work. But it all started in Alaska, in the woods in Alaska, and here I am. So it's an odd path.
Great, thanks, Deborah. We'll talk a little bit more about your journey writing libretti. You've written 10, but you actually are now just starting on Women of Lockerbie, right? After all these years as an opera, is that
I
correct?
found my composer.
You found your composer.
I found my composer after many, many
So
years.
some things take time, but
It
that's
does. And
really
when I found
exciting.
the right one, I grabbed them, and so we don't have a commission yet, but yes.
Yeah, very exciting, very exciting. We'll talk more about that in a moment. John, I'd love to move to you. Your journey is somewhat different, and tell us a little bit about your creative background and how you found your way into becoming a librettist.
So it's definitely somewhat different from Deborah, but it is similar to yours, Larry. As you know, we both started out as dancers. I got into ballet dancing when I was very, very young because my mother didn't have a babysitter one day and my sister was in class and they pulled me in. And so that's how that started. And I began doing straight theater and musical theater when I got to college, and professionally when I left college. And opera was a very just serendipitous thing that happened very spontaneously when a local company needed a choreographer, and I took the job and thought, no, this is interesting. This is kind of fun. And so I started choreographing opera while I was still doing musicals and straight plays and ballets, all kinds of things. And something that really struck me was how there was so much new work going on. And I started an opera about 15, 16 years ago. And all of these great new pieces were premiering at different companies, and I really wanted to be a part of that. But I felt that there was a very small select group of directors who were doing all of them, and it seemed like it was very difficult to break in and become a part of that process. And I had always been a short story writer, just for myself, for years. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just write my own. And one day in a used bookstore, I found a book of poetry and thought it was really fabulous. And from that, I crafted a libretto in conjunction with the poet. And then I was introduced to Clint Borzoni, who is, of course, an ALT alum. And we wrote our first opera together, which took, I think, 5 years to get produced, which I then directed. And then we got a commission from Arizona Opera to do a full-length piece called The Copper Queen, which was made into a feature film during COVID. And between all of that, I also did the AOI program in Washington, which was an incredible experience, just a real crash course in libretto writing, where you really kind of sink or swim because it's 20 minutes and any subject you like, which is really kind of tricky to do. And ended up writing a 20-minute farce comedy called Service Provider that has had 18 productions since it premiered at the Kennedy Center, and just opened a new production of it in Minnesota. And what I love about what I do is I really strive to write things that can be for people who've been to the opera for their whole lives, or if they've never been, and hopefully we'll get them involved and interested in something that's still very relevant.
Great. Thanks so much, John. Yeah, we do have a somewhat similar background, but I have yet to write a libretto. So there you had
Still
definitely
young,
have that
Larry.
to think.
Still
Yes,
young.
exactly. Still young enough to try, right? Deep, let's talk about your journey. Another very different path and very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the weirdo that has no formal training. No, I'm just joking. I definitely have the training of the CLDP, which is, I would absolutely say is a sense of formal training. But prior to that, I came into this world as a spoken word artist. I was a performer, traveling all over the world, leading writing workshops, publishing poems, as well as short stories. I had a poetry collection that already came out, and I was serving as the first Black Poet Laureate of the city of Houston. In that role, Houston Grand Opera came to me and said, "Would you like to write a spoken word opera?" And I was like, "I don't know what that does, but it sounds amazing." And so I was like, "I want to say yes to things that I've never done before." So I said yes, and then immediately was like, "What did I just say yes to?" And so I started Googling libretti and pulling them off of the internet because University of YouTube. And just reading things and trying to figure out what was this form that I was being asked to create something in. And from it came my first opera, Marian Song with Houston Grand Opera, which debuted March 7th of 2020. So we all know how that went. We had a really great opening, and the next day the theater shut down forever and ever. Someone asked, what's the CLDP? That's the Composer and Librettist Development Program with the American Lyric Theater. Sorry, I'm speaking acronyms. Everyone in opera does. You will learn them. Welcome. And so from that experience, honestly, I thought that was going to be my last opera. I was like, that was fun. That was something. We did it. Woo! But the world is shut down and we'll never do that again. So I started working on books and offstage productions, which I published a book, another memoir with Macmillan last year, and was really like kind of leaning into that until I got into the Composer and Librettist Development Program, which really was kind of just a kind of reset in some ways of really being like, hey, this is a real thing that could be possible and not just kind of one fluke collaboration. But I started really finding that there was a skill set and a group of people who really believed that I belonged in the space of opera. And as a former classical pianist, I loved the music, right? And so I started to really start to think about what does it mean for me to inhabit a space in opera that is in the storytelling seat, and really kind of like diving in and learning. Since then, I've written 5 operas in the last few years. I'm getting ready to open my second full-length opera. Right now, I'm sitting in St. Louis as part of the New Works Collective for Opera Theater St. Louis, which I'll be opening a 20-minute piece this weekend. And so, I'm slated to open a new 20-minute piece at the Kennedy Center in January. So just thinking through all of these kind of great opportunities I've had a chance. And actually, I'm wrong. This is my 6th opera because I wrote a piece for Atlanta Opera. I forgot that one. So this is my getting ready to open my 6th opera, my second full length, and yeah, just enjoying it so far.
Great. And Deep will talk more about this, but also ALT, the CLDP, there's been a couple of questions in the chat. So the Composer Librettist Development Program is ALT's resident artist program for emerging opera composers and librettists. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the program. But one of the things that both you and Deborah got out of the CLDP beyond training, as you were saying, was meeting collaborators. right? And some of these collaborators that you've worked with now on multiple projects as well, right?
Absolutely. I mean, so much, and we'll talk about this more, but so much of working in opera is centered in finding your composer as a librettist. And we probably all will say that, those collaborations are really what have kept us working. And, CLDP for me was definitely a huge start in thinking about who my favorite collaborators are and who kind of clicks with me.
Great. Well, Michael, again, your journey different. Tell us about how did you end up in this crazy, wonderful art form?
Well, I think that if I had ever set out to do it, I never would have gotten there. One thing leads to another. I did have a music background in performance. I played the classical organ and harpsichord and piano. I music directed in Boston when I was in college. And though I loved operas and loved musicals and loved all kinds of music, I never saw myself writing it. And I was actually in an early music group in Boston playing the harpsichord, having two recorder players noodling in my ear. And I just I said, I don't like early music. I never liked early music. I don't want to hear Vivaldi again as long as I live. I'm going into journalism, which was my other love. And I came to New York. I dropped out of school, came to New York, started studying at NYU undergraduate journalism, but then I promptly got a job at the Village Voice opening the mail. And pretty soon I was an assistant editor on writing about things I was not qualified to write about, and editing people whose copy, you wouldn't believe some of the people they let, this 19-year-old jerk edit their copy, but I did it. And I love journalism. And this was in the years when the gay rights movement was flourishing, pretty soon after Stonewall. Only a few years, and groups were growing up all over the country. Pride marches were being established in every city. And I loved reporting on that. And then I stayed in journalism. I became an editor of 3 Manhattan weeklies. Every week I'd put out an East Side edition, a Village edition, and a West Side edition. It was lots of work. I loved it, but I got burnt out. And I wanted to go back to music, and I had no training really in writing music, but I was writing music on the side, and I needed someone to fill in the words. That ended up being me. So I was writing my own lyrics to my own music, and I made a bargain with my spouse. We've been together, God knows how many years, 40 years. I would quit my job in journalism, and I had supported him when he left his job to go into dance, postmodern dance, and he would support me to try and break into musical theater. And one of the first pieces I wrote got developed at Playwrights Horizons, which is a musical theater, and somebody said, "This is an opera." I was writing it with Stuart Wallace. Neither of us knew we were writing an opera, but it was mostly sung. And suddenly they wanted to do it at the Houston Grand Opera. Richard Foreman was going to direct it. It was a wonderful experience, and I got sort of thrown into the deep end. But what I found so exciting about opera in those days was that wasn't just writing words to songs. I was the playwright, except that the play happened to be sung. And I was learning how to be a playwright at the same time I was learning this strange world of opera with all these Italian terms that I didn't understand. And it's all set of rules that I didn't understand. And it was big. You got big orchestras and big choruses. And I found that after this first piece, which started as a musical and became an opera, the next piece was an opera. It was about Harvey Milk, and it was one of the first big gay out operas. And I was able to bring in all my journalistic experience with this new world of opera. And I felt that musical theater was not receptive to anything like that, but that opera was, particularly Houston, which seems like a conservative place, but the Houston Grand Opera was risky, and they had put themselves on the map. You know, Philip Glass and John Adams, and opera was Meredith Monk. Opera was changing. Tony Davis, things were changing, and I felt I could reach new audiences that I could never have reached otherwise. Opera was pretty conservative in those days, too. People who paid for opera, the boards of directors, were staunch Republicans. And I felt, oh, I can really make a difference here with my lefty politics, doing these things in opera houses. And, you know, but I did find that I wanted to go back and write musicals. So I found a comfort zone where when I was writing an opera, I would also be starting a musical. And in those days, you could get a commission for writing an opera, and you wouldn't get 5 cents for writing a musical until it got done. So I could support my musical theater habit by writing operas. And I always like going back and forth. And I think that's one of the things in life. You just sort of never are able to climb directly up the ladder. You have to go side to side as if two ladders are next to each other and keep switching back and forth and be ahead of it. And opera now is changing. I think it's so wonderful, this program here. CLDP has brought so many interesting voices to the fore, and the audience is not as conservative as it used to be. The big operas these days that people want to go see are the new operas, and the audience is getting younger. So I think that brings new sets of challenges. And most of all, you can write you could be a part of creating beautiful music that moves people. Music that speaks to audiences in ways that popular music or theater music may not. It can stretch the boundaries of music, and it can get you right in here. That's what thrills me the most of all.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Well, I want to bounce off of something you've been talking about with the music, and you have a music background. And I mean, obviously, writing an opera is, for a librettist, a collaboration with the composer, right? And that relationship is critical. I'd love for each of you to talk a little bit about your music background, and for those of you who don't have a formal training in music, how do you navigate the relationship with the composer, and those who have a more formal training in music? How does that dialogue work? Why don't I start with John?
So yeah, I my mother would have loved for me to do piano, but I'm terrible at counting past 8, as most dancers are. So I always approach it more from a dramatic and dramaturgical standpoint than a musical one. And I find that the skills that I have as a director will definitely help curtail musical ideas and thoughts about it. So I always speak more in dramatic terms and musical terms. And out of the, I think, 9 composers I've collaborated with, once we figure out that language and they figure out that when I mean something is frenetic, that means, you know, we accelerando a bit here or whatever it is, then we really just kind of develop our own way of talking about it.
Great. D.E.E.P, how about you?
Yeah, so I wasn't trained in classical music unless you take my high school music teacher putting me in a practice room with sheet music and an electric piano and saying, work it out. Um, I took, keyboarding classes in school. It wasn't anything big, but I did love Chopin, and I loved like playing by ear. And my grandmother would put my hands on hers as she played the organ when I was young. And there was something about music that I think always I felt told a story. So the beautiful part about that is that a lot of the formal language I do need to be, I'm able to kind of have a conversation and understand the basics of what the composer is putting together. But I kind of agree, with John, that it really then starts to lean towards what is the narrative arc and what are we trying to convey and what is the emotional movement behind the work? How do we tap into what that emotion is? Because I think whether it's the words or the music, there has to be a soul behind it. There has to be a goal of telling a story. We want to move people. And I think when you start to speak on those terms, that's when you start to have effective collaborations, when you guys can agree to what is it that we want from our audience and really start to drive in that direction.
Great. Michael, what about you? And since you have more of a formal musical training, do you find yourself speaking and working in musical terms with your collaborators? Does it change from collaborator to collaborator?
Yes, but I feel that you have to, when you enter writing an opera, uh, it's a multi-year uh, project oftentimes. But you have to do multiple drafts, workshops, readings, tryouts, and then orchestration. It has to have a musical impulse from the very beginning. If you don't feel that this story can be sung, that it would be better off as a play, that naturalism is what it wants to be, then you probably don't want to make it an opera. I think that uh, you have to serve the music and you have to let the music be the playwright as well. Because the music, if you took away your words, the music would still have to tell that story, the architecture of that story. And that means hitting emotional points, setting up conflicts. And it's not written like a play, and it's not written like a song lyric. It's, if anything, to me, I found it closer to journalism. Who, why, what, where, when. You need those, and you need to put the operative word on the operative note so that the audience feels it when it's sung, and that the word isn't buried in the middle of the musical phrase. It connects. The music and the words have to connect and forward the story. And I always look at it like musically, it's like a musical roller coaster, in that you're going up that hill to the very peak, and then you go over, and then that's when the first act curtain comes down. You reach the peak. Whereas writing a musical or writing an album or a song spiel or whatever is more like up and down electrocardion, talk, sing, talk, sing. Opera constantly builds on the scene that came before it. And I think you have to think musically. If you don't know music, then listen to everything you possibly can. Imbue yourself in music. Listen to music without words and start putting words to it. Because what you can't do is just write a play and ask a composer to make a musical drama out of that. We don't speak like you sing. We speak in fractured phrases. We say yeah, uh-huh. You can't sing that stuff. And when you try to, it brings down the music. It makes it like musical wallpaper. You want to assist the music and make it go on its journey.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that, Michael.
Can I just say to that,
Please.
Michael, like I think that's why for me it's not like journalism, it's like poetry, right? Like poetry is an unnatural speech pattern. It's
That's right.
right,
It's
it lives
stylized.
more beautiful and fantastical and flowery, and I mean not even always, but it lives in the moment in a way that I think musical
No,
tendencies.
you're totally right.
Right?
Poetry and music and the libretto are stylized and in their way direct. What I
Yeah.
meant by journalism is that you don't have a lot of time to get to your topic sentence. That's what I mean. You kind of have to know what this moment is about, whether it's a quartet or it's a solo or it's a big ensemble. You kind of have to hit the theme and come back to it a couple of times. In musical theater, we call it a hook. We might not do it as much in opera, but it's a similar kind of logical, clear construction. It's not uh, implied drama like a lot of playwriting is. That's where you have a lot of subtext. You don't have as much subtext in opera, and if you do, that's the music's job.
Right.
That's a great distinction, Michael.
Mhm.
Absolutely, because there's so much of the composer's job is the subtext, right?
It's the subtext, it's the psychology of the characters, it's bringing in leitmotif from a scene before that you know begins to affect their thinking and their hearts. And the words have to leave room for the music to do its own playwriting.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Deborah, do you want to dovetail off of that?
Yeah, I have no musical training. I have no musical ability. I can't read music. I can't sing. I am from a family of singers. My parents were in a Gilbert and Sullivan Opera Company. My brothers sang I Can't Carry a Tune. I'm married to a very well-known singer. I live in an incredible musical family with my stepkids all in the theater. And I think that's the reason why I'm a writer, because I can't sing. If I could sing, I would never write. But I guess I'm sort of living proof that you can also do this if you don't have the training for it, because I don't have the training, a musical training for it. For reasons I don't understand, maybe it's because I have lived with music all my life, and in a musical family where I didn't have that ability. I know how to write something that can be sung. I know I have a nose for how to set a lyric, or I have a nose for what is musical and what is not. And I think it's largely intuitive, but it's also I approach it as a playwright, because I did come to this as a playwright, because I really think of I identify the musical moment as that place where something, I like to say, rises to the level of music where the words are simply insufficient, or the words need an extra lift. I or I know the musical moment where speech begins to fail and where it can only be sung. So I think of it in purely dramatic terms, and um that's how I sort of find the music. In terms of working with music, again, it's largely intuitive, but what I do love about opera, and I wish musical theater would do this more, is I understand the notion of motif, and I like to work with motifs, and I like to work thematically. And opera music is really sort of built in that, in a way that a lot of musical theater isn't, you know. And so I sort of I understand the architecture of music, even though I don't have the training in it. I know this doesn't make sense, but for those, it's actually very comforting to my students, especially at Columbia, who are all in a panic because they don't know music and they don't know how to read music and they don't have musical training. And I'm like, I don't either, you know, and I'm doing it, so you can do it. And you know, think like the playwright, think like the poet. Um, uh, y- um, and you can do it. And I never try to speak to composers in musical language, because they speak Greek to me. I don't know what they're talking about, but I can tell. I talk to them in playwriting terms, and I talk to them in character terms, and I know when it's right, and I can usually articulate it in dramatic language and playwriting language, not in musical language. So that's how I approach it. It's again, largely intuitive.
Well, I really appreciate that, because I think it's important that one does not need to be a musician or even speak a composer's language to be a wonderful librettist, right? You do need to be able to communicate with them. You need to be able to speak your language and make sure that you can find a way for them to translate into their language, right? As a composer. You mentioned something. You said the architecture, and of course at ALT we talk a lot about architectural structure, like when we're doing outlines. At ALT we teach a very specific process that involves outlining even before, both for the composer and the librettist, even before a word of music or a word of the text is written. I'd love to talk a little bit about what architecture means for all of you as a librettist, and how that interfaces with the composer. Deborah, since you said it, would you start?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think of it as the oh boy, that's hard. The skeleton of the work. I work very closely with the composer in outlining, and that's where we're building. I mean, I'm doing all the playwriting stuff, right? I know the story, I know the events, I know the characters, or I don't know, but you know, when in the process of writing, you're developing that. And then finding the best musical expression of that, which I do that in very close collaboration with the composer. so that, and I will spend, like when I was writing Steal a Pencil for Me with Gerald Cohen, it's a full-length opera. I spent 4 to 5 months working full-time on the outline with Gerald, figuring out musically how that was going to be told, developing, knowing what was aria, what was recit, where we're bringing everybody together for trio, quartet, ensemble, chorus, what the themes were, so that I could create lyric that I knew could be thematically like we had the pencil theme, for example. The pencil was the pencil that sent everybody to Auschwitz. So it was the death theme, but the pencil was taken over by the lovers, and then it became the love theme. So that I knew that whenever the pencil was in the scene, that I needed to write lyric that could support a musical gesture that that could put love and hate in conversation, right, with each other. And so I consider that sort of architectural. I don't know if that's making any sense. But it only took me 3 weeks to write the full-length libretto, but it was 4 to 5 months of really constructing that. The outline is not an outline for what you're going to do. It's not an outline for the work. It is the work. You're building the structure that will then support that musical composition. I don't know if that.
You're not the first librettist to tell me that they spent much more time on the outline than the actual libretto itself. So,
Always.
and I see a lot of nodding among the panelists.
I don't do this with musicals or plays, though. For some reason, the outlining does not work with musicals and plays. I will create an outline to sort of get myself going, but I always end up throwing it out and discovering as I go along. But they're built differently. You're working differently with the composer in musical theater. In musical theater, you're building the moment, each moment by moment together with the composer. I'm commenting on the music. I'm, in a way that I work a little more separately when I'm doing the libretto, and the composer in the opera works a little separately, but that the collaboration happens at that architectural phase. I mean, obviously there's back and forth when you're composing, but it's very different than musical theater. And the outlining does not work in the same way in musical theater or playwriting, my experience at least.
Sure. Michael, what are your thoughts about the outlining process, and how does that work for you?
Well, it's all a part of this architecture building. A film can be edited into shape. The cutting and the intercutting and the editing, that creates a rhythm and a means of telling a story. You cannot edit an opera into shape. You need support beams. You need a floor, walls, a roof, and doors and windows. And I think of it kind of like a geography or a topography. The basic architecture or of an outline is, if you think in threes, and that would work for a 90-minute opera or a 3-act grand opera or a 20-minute opera like John talked about. The first act, meet your characters and get them up a tree. The second act, throw rocks at them. The third act, get them down. Now you have to do that within a certain time frame. You cannot go on for 4 hours. You can't have one character come out and sing like Fricka in the Ring for an hour. No one can afford to put on that opera, and that's why with a play you may let the characters lead you, but with an opera you kind of need to know what your ending is, almost more than you need to know what your beginning is. And that is why an outline is so important in opera. If you just start writing and composing, you may never get to the heart of your story after 2 hours. You have to know where the conflicts are happening, how to keep your main characters in focus, how to alternate them with the other characters and the ensemble, and hit the sweet spots that you need to hit. I guess in musical theater, we break all those things down. We call them opening numbers and I want songs and comedy songs and duets and 11 o'clock numbers and things like that. We don't do that in opera, but roughly that is, if you can intuit that into your opera outline, it won't hurt. It will help.
Right, those elements can still be embedded into the architecture,
That's
even though they're
right. The
not these
basic
discrete
principle of
moments.
that is the basic principle is that is if you have a lead or a set of leads in your opera, people will give themselves, they'll suspend disbelief if they know what those characters want, where they want to go. Say, okay, I'll go along with them on that ride. But if they don't know, and if you wait an hour and a half to clarify what your lead not necessarily, I mean Wozzeck doesn't know what he wants from the beginning to the end, but you're with him on that journey. That has great architecture. That's written in how many scenes? 9 scenes, something like that. And it has this inexorable flow towards horror and tragedy. And you get the feeling of it from the music and the story right from the beginning, and then it goes as far as it can go. And I don't think that was based on a play. And in that case, the play served as the outline. I think you need to know your ending.
John, as a choreographer and a dancer, of course, architecture is in most forms of dance a big part of your process. How has that influenced your work, or is your work in opera not influenced by that sort of structural planning? I would think that happens in dance.
It's 100%. That's how I learned. I mean, I learned about story structure in drama by studying Nutcracker, Swan Lake, Coppelia, all of these different pieces where you would see the ebbs and flows with the score. And I didn't even realize that I was being trained for opera in the ballet world. I mean, the ballet world is all pantomime and different, but what I will say is that I draw it. I'm a very visual person, so I will just start with a marker board or a sheet of paper, and I'll just start with shapes and squares and saying, okay, here, 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 here. I think that one of the best examples I can think of what helped me was when I was at AOI and I knew I had 20 minutes and I wanted to write a comedy because I thought a comedy would be more challenging. I thought to myself, well, 20 minutes is the length of a sitcom episode without the commercials. So why can't I start with an A story and a B story and see how those intersect and resolve by the end? And that format worked perfectly in that sequence. So I think that sometimes, especially if you're finding your voice and finding out what method works for you, you can look to other forms, whether it's a play, whether it's a TV, whether it's a film, whether it's an album, whatever it is. And if there's a structure there that you feel is really, really successful, sometimes you can apply it to, something of your own until you figure out your own path.
Great. And Deep, but as a poet, how do you think about structure and how does that play into your work as a librettist?
So I want to say that, Michael and Deborah have way more experience than I do, and I disagree completely with them.
No, but this is what we want to hear. You're a brilliant librettist in your own right, and you approach it differently. So I would love to hear this.
Yeah, and what I disagree with, I think, is more with Deborah, what she said about in working with musicals and those things that they don't need as much as that structure. I'm currently writing my first musical, and I'm like, the first thing I did was outline everything, right? It was like I needed that backbone, I needed that structure, even if the motives and stuff of things of how we were going to work weren't as clear for me and were maybe left more in my composer's hands. I had to understand what the story was. I think for me, the difference in kind of working in opera space goes down to something as simple as the way that the brochure comes out for an opera, right? And by that, I mean, when you go to an opera and you open the program, and you're like, what is this opera about? It gives you every spoiler that there probably is of what that opera does, right? It's like so-and-so dies in the third act, right? Like that's kind of how it feels. because for so much of opera, I feel it's not about what the journey you're going to go on is as much as it is how you're going to go on that journey, right? What is the music going to do? How am I going to feel when I get there? The plot may be very simple, but the twists and turns in between are kind of the parts that you sit and live for the nuance. You live for the aria and the high note, right? Like that's kind of what opera does differently. Whereas, you know, a musical, you come in, yes, for the music, but really interested in what is the story going to do, and where am I going to arrive once I get there. And that focus, I think, is how it shifts and change how my architecture works. I absolutely agree with Michael. I know the end of everything when I sit down to write it. Even books, right? When I sit down to write a book, I'm like, this is going to be the climax. This is how it ends. I already know. Does that mean that I don't give myself room for that to change? Absolutely not. And I think that that has to be there. You have to have a malleability when it comes to the work of realizing like this is where I originally thought was going to be the focus. But as I'm writing and shifting and changing, these characters are doing something different, and I kind of got to follow them and see where they go. And I think that having that structure, that very clear, you know, one of the things I learned in the CLDP was really thinking about the scene by scene, right? That's something that I agreed with Deborah. I spend a lot of time on in the very beginning of writing down, like this scene will transition to this scene, we'll go to this scene, we'll take us to this scene. That for me is so much of the work that has to happen before even the composer can enter into the emotional and motivic structure of what the piece is going to be. We have to know what the story we're telling is, what the point we're trying to make, if there's a point. And even if the point is just entertainment, right? I'm not saying that everything has to be a political statement, but I do think that we all have to be on the same board of the goal of what the piece is trying to do, what it wants to be in the world, for us to be able to move forward to really creating some kind of clear collaboration.
Great.
You know,
Well,
Larry, if I could jump in, just
of
one more
course.
thing. One thing that I found incredibly helpful, and I recommend it to folks out there. I was approached by the Anchorage Opera, and they asked me to take Fledermaus, Strauss's Fledermaus, and to create a new Alaskan adaptation of it. And then later they hired me to take Mozart's Impresario, which has a dreadful libretto, and they said, fix it, write a new libretto for this. And at first I didn't want to do that work because I had all this my own stuff that I wanted to do. They made it worth my while, which is why I did it. And I was at the end, I was incredibly it was one of the most profound learning experiences because in order to redo Fledermaus, it was like a 3-hour long music first exercise. I had to get into a very deep conversation. It was like doing a masterclass with Mozart, you know? And by having to do that adaptation and to take that music and reset it in a, you know, in this sort of new version that I was making, it was profound in terms of learning the structure of a grand opera and of and how to work with music. Anyway, I just want to mention that because I would do another one of those in a heartbeat, but that really sort of the structural stuff got into my bones through that exercise. It was really helpful. Anyway.
That's great. So now you're recommending that everyone rewrite the libretto of their opera of choice. It's actually not a bad idea as an exercise. You know, it's actually a fascinating process because of what you learn about
There ain't
structure.
no more ideas for CLDP. No more.
Yeah, I'm making notes
no
on
more assignments.
new class assignments for the CLDP, right? Great. Well, you know, something that each of you have touched on in some ways is about, you know, a story that needs to be sung. I mean, how do you know a story needs to be sung? Like Deborah, you said you know your play needed to be sung, and that's why it needed to be an opera. Michael, someone told you this musical you were working on was an opera, right? What is it that tells you a story needs to be sung and not told through another channel, through a straight play, through a musical, through a film, whether it's a short story? What is it about the story that compels it to be sung?
I can jump in. You know, young people today have that expression, oh, it's so extra. When I find a story that has that extra thing, that's what tells me it's an opera as opposed to a musical. That there's something about the vocal production that is required in singing opera that that sort of puts it into an arena where you're either dealing with really extreme situations or really deep emotions or really elevated, they're not small stories, they're big stories. There's a scope and a depth and a scale to them, a size, a depth. It's extra, and it requires, it's extra. That's how I know it's an opera. I don't know if
You
that's
know, when you divorce opera from all the stuff that vocal coaches teach opera singers, I look at opera singers. I'm reacting to Deborah's word extreme, which I agree. I think that they're the ultimate actors. They are acting, putting the voice out there at the very edge of their emotional range.
Mhm.
And I think that sometimes you have to look at yourself. It's maybe a little bit like a method acting thing. Bring your own experience, how you relate to this character. Just get lost in thought. Sometimes I listen to music, or sometimes I'll go to a museum and look at paintings to clear my mind and feel my way into a story. If I can connect it and it feels extreme, then it needs music. And it can give the opera singers and the opera composers the stuff that they need to fill that house with music.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about approach. Like I am a terrible person at this just because I am a huge genre bender. That is what I have based my entire career off of, is saying, where's your box? I don't care, and burning it down. And so I think for me, so much of the work is that the work tells you what it wants to be. There's sometimes when I'm writing something and I'm like, man, I just need someone to sing this. Oh man, there's a rhythm here that feels like a song. Like this wants to be sung. So it either wants to be a song cycle or it wants to be an opera. I let the work kind of lead. And I know that's kind of a cop out, because it's like, but what if I don't know what that sounds like? Then how am I supposed to do it? I'm sorry, I don't know. I think for me, I was kind of given, this is how this system works. What can you build inside of it? And then from there, I kind of got to know what its voice was. And when I learned what the voice of opera was, it was like, oh, okay, this is what it wants to be, and it sounds like, and it feels. I think that there are extra moments in musicals. I think that there are operas that sound like, are they a musical? I fight that Hamilton is an opera. You can fight me. It's okay. Right. So
I
think
actually agree. I agree with you.
I
right,
agree.
like it's sung from
Yeah.
beginning to end. We don't
Yeah.
take any, like, I don't know, there's a lot of arguments, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that there is so much space now, especially when contemporary works are being exalted, to take all of the rules of what should be something and completely throw them out the window. Right. My first opera was literally half spoken word. That person didn't even sing. She didn't even know how to sing, right? She's not a singer. And I think starting there for me said, everything is possible, and it's really more about the treatment of the voice. It's about thinking, like, does this thing make space for an unamplified voice, which is a huge part of opera, right? You're not going to see opera singers typically with microphones on. That's just not part of the tradition of what opera is. And so there is something to thinking about, what does that natural voice do for you, and what are its limitations, and what are its, ways that it blows those limitations out of the water, and can you tap into it for this specific piece? And that doesn't mean that all operas do that. There are some operas that are amplified, right? But I do think it's about, like, thinking about the tradition of what it has been, and saying, how can I add to that tradition? How can I build from that tradition into something that's more new and innovative and speaks to the everyday of my current existence?
Larry, I noticed that a question just came in from Teresa Howard. In
Mhm.
what way do you see comic opera fitting into the extra and extreme scenarios?
Great.
Comedy is extreme.
Always.
Comedy is touches very close to the darkest situations, and we may find it funny. Other people are going through hell, but whether it's Gilbert and Sullivan or The Marriage of Figaro, to those people it's life and death. So comic opera works very well with extreme, particularly when a modern director does it, like Peter Sellers' production of Marriage of Figaro, where Figaro is hurling eggs in a building that looks like Trump Tower. He was ahead of his time.
Yes, he was.
I
But
can speak to that also, Larry,
please,
about
John. Yeah.
because I think that it's something that I've kind of started to be known for. They're always like, "Oh, get John to write it." And I think that what I have come to accept is that virtually all comedy is nothing but schadenfreude. It's laughing
Yep.
at the misery of someone else. It's laughing at a terrible situation. So just like Michael said, while for example, if someone slips on a banana peel, it's not a big deal to us. It's a huge deal to the person who's going to have a gigantic bruise on their hip the next day. And all comedy is I'm glad it wasn't me. And so I think that you tap into the extremities of the emotions of the person that it's happening to. And then by reflecting it, that's where the comedy comes from. And just real quick to go back to the thing we were talking about earlier, because it fits into this too. Most of the time, if I want to find out if a piece is an opera or a play, is on a certain level, I have to put people in situations where they don't talk quite as much. They can have a lot to say, but you can't have an opera that is just a transcript. Like, for example, I think it would be very, very difficult to do a successful opera of the play Frost Nixon because it's nothing but dialogue and two people sitting. You'd have to edit so much of that great dialogue. So I think that you can have certain sequences that are dialogue heavy with recit or spoken or whatever it is, but I think that you have to have quite a few moments in the piece where there's reflection with fewer words, whether it's actually to someone or just to themselves, and that enables you to bring in music for subtext. I always tell people when they ask me, how do you write an aria? It's like, well, how many lines of dialogue do you have to have? Well, my aria has to have 7 lines. I'm like, okay, find a way to make it have 3. Because if you can't take out something, the music, like Michael said, has zero purpose to be there. So you just have to trust that the collaboration is strong enough and the communication is strong enough to where those lines that you work so hard on that are so precious that are taken out are then filled back in by the music, which is what opera should do.
Some plays are their own music. I mean, look at Long Jay's Journey into Night or some of the wonderful plays by August Wilson. They use repetition. They have arias, they're just not sung.
Yes.
So why would you want to make an opera and take all that gorgeous music out of what's already in the play? That's
why
not
there's no
something I
David
would want
Mamet.
to. Right. I wouldn't want to adapt those into an opera. It's an opera without music as it is.
Yeah.
Great. That's great. I want to get to a couple of the questions that have come in the Q&A, and then we'll wrap up with a short discussion of resources that are available for librettists. Nicole Mitchell asks, how does one go about getting the rights to a screenplay that is based off a book? There are some resources that are on actually the ALT website from last symposium we did. There's a 2-session video with Jim Kendrick, who is an intellectual property and entertainment lawyer that we did. So I'd encourage you to look at that. There were also some sample agreements, but just a discussion of the different types of rights and how those are typically acquired. And so that's at altnyc.org, and just look for the link for the 2021 Opera Writers Symposium. But while we have this panel here, for those who have dealt with underlying rights, would love to hear any advice you have about that process that you can share in the short version of that advice. It is a pretty complicated subject all on its own, of course.
Well, I took that workshop that ALT sponsored during the pandemic, where you had the lawyer talking about underlying rights, and he said, when it comes to movies, don't do it. You can't get good. He said, just don't do it, because you can't get the movie theater rights, or the movie producing rights are so complicated that no opera company will deal with it. And I've got some movies I would love to adapt, but he said, if you're going to do it, get an opera company to commission it and let them fight the battle on the rights, because you, the writer, aren't going to get it. But I have.
In the case of movies, though, sometimes you can separate musical grand rights from opera rights. And they'll, most of the time, they're looking for what they call a Class A production. That's not a qualitative term. It's just what they mean Broadway, where they can make the most money.
Right.
But they don't always think of opera, and opera is sometimes lumped into the musical theater, musical stage rights. If you can separate it, then sometimes you can get those properties.
And I would say Michael ALT's actually done that for a couple of our
Right.
commissions for
You just
properties
got
that,
opera rights,
right,
yeah.
it's a carve out for the opera rights that
Right,
still provide the opportunity for them to exploit those rights in
right.
a much more lucrative form. I would say one of the big things that one usually has to do with the film studios is make it really clear that no one's going to get rich off of this opera.
Right.
It's not going to play on
So
Broadway for
Deborah
10
is
years.
right that you should get their legal department to do it because you don't want to pay $400 an hour.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, can I also add too is depending on what the piece is, it may have come from a piece of literature, and you may be able to get the rights to the literature that the work is based on that is not connected to the movie rights.
Correct.
Yes.
So
Right.
something like a Wizard of Oz, right? You may not get, you know what I'm saying? You may not be able to use ruby red slippers because that was something specific to the movie adaptation. But in the original, there was silver slippers. And so you may be able to get around it by just making something that's that small of a tweak to your storytelling that gives you rights to something that's in the public domain or that's in the literature. So
That also goes for nonfiction. You can,
yeah,
I want to write a book about some charismatic charlatan religious figure based on the facts. But if you use the interpretation of those facts that was in the book, that's copyrightable. The facts alone, fine, but you cannot use the interpretation. So it's a complicated thing.
Absolutely.
yeah, if you have representation, an agent, or even someone that you trust in entertainment law that can help you navigate that, I would strongly encourage that you do that if you can't go directly to the company to be able to resolve that for you.
And I would highly recommend that you don't embark on a project without the rights. I know too many folks who have actually spent a lot of time developing a piece only to hit a brick wall when it comes to the rights, and it's really disappointing. And they may have written something fantastic, and the rights are
Right.
they're just frozen out of that opportunity.
But you can adapt recent history. You can adapt yesterday's newspaper. You can adapt people that are public
Public
figures,
figures, right?
as long as you're not taking it from a previous literary or dramatic source. That is a kind of adaptation, but
Right.
it's ripped from the headlines, and you may find a way to stylize that into an opera.
Absolutely. And these subjects are covered in that discussion that we had a couple of years ago. But it's definitely something that you want professional guidance on to pursue. Christine McDonough asks, I'd love to hear more about finding and approaching composers. Do you proactively reach out to composers? Do you share summaries, synopses, themes, or even completed librettis? What has been your process for finding collaborators?
I can jump in on that. Well, first of all, I listen to a lot of music. I take a look, for example, at the composers who are getting the grants at Opera America. There's a whole lot of different grant programs. I go on YouTube. I listen to their music. So I do that. And if and also just being in the business, I meet a lot of composers. And if I really like somebody's music or I like their sensibility, I'll try to come up with some ideas for them. I spend a lot of in collaboration with them. I've probably got 6 projects right now with different composers that we're now trying to get commissions to write. What I do as a librettist is I spend all of my spare time, not that I have very much of it, but I'm always looking for ideas. And if I find something that strikes me as a really great idea, I'll develop it just enough, like, the 1-page idea, because a lot of the way that I get my work is I get phone calls from opera companies who say, we have this composer who's never written an opera, so they need a strong librettist and so we want you to come in and be the librettist. Well, then, or I'll get invited out to coffee by composers who want to talk about writing together. And I never go into those meetings with no ideas. I usually have like 6 developed ideas in my back pocket to propose that you can then begin collaborating on. So I actually work at it quite a bit. I'm always developing ideas. I'm always listening to composers. If I like them, there's stuff that ask them to go out for coffee. I propose ideas. I'm very proactive about that. That's how I do it.
Great. Somebody just asked, I've heard not to embark on an opera till there's a company commission.
Yes, don't write your opera. Michael Korie, who was my teacher, told me that. He said, don't write your opera.
So you can start your opera, you can conceive your opera, but don't finish it. Don't finish it. If you're going to be developing it with a company, that's their business too. That's their joy to join with you, to collaborate, to create this new thing that never existed before. If you finish it and you come in with a giant supermarket carton full of your opera and the score, they're going to run the other way.
Yeah. I mean, I will say as a general director of two companies, I probably get about 10 submissions a week of completed or very completed work. And companies want to also find a way to find that intersection between your work and their community that they're producing in as well.
Exactly.
And that process is really, really important. So I think as you're considering that, think about that, not only your work from your perspective, but who you're looking to pitch it to as a producer, and how you can present it in a way that is going to engage them as a partner, just not someone who is facilitating the production of your work. It's a different conversation and it will go much farther. So
it's also exciting to people like us to go into other communities and learn about them and respond to the needs of that company and community.
Great.
Someone asked, there's no hope of getting a finished opera produced.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of jump in a little bit. I know that we should not write our whole operas. I definitely agree with that. But if you've never worked with your collaborator before, most companies will want to see that you can work together. So there may be something as simple as writing an aria from a scene that you are really excited about. I mean, just because you have an idea for something and you want to start writing it doesn't mean you have to see it all the way through. I also think that it also depends on what you give them. And this is probably the unpopular thing, but just because you wrote it doesn't mean you have to show everyone. Just putting it out there is that there is a way to have a finished opera or have a completed manuscript in your mind and to only show a portion of it and say, this is what I'm thinking of. Here's the first scene. And you just pocket it to yourself and don't tell people that.
And it's not finished anyway till the curtain goes up on the opening night. It's never finished.
There is that. As far as getting a finished opera produced, I think that that's a little more complicated in a couple of ways. Let's say you had an opera, you finished it. You're excited about it. You can do something like an Opera of America idea grant that gets you the ability to put it up as a workshop. So you can kind of see it on stage. You can have singers sing it. You can invite companies that are interested and say, this is something that's in process. And it's still being shaped, but I want to invite people in to see what we have so far. There are ways around it. If you have already finished it, don't feel like it's a death sentence. It's just a more kind of open and easier process if that is a vehicle that is still open to be shaped, right? Everyone wants to be able to say that they put their stamp and their name and that they were part of the process. That's opera is more collaborative, I think, than anything I've ever worked in. And I think that, that's kind of the selling point. And so if you have an opera that's already been staged and it's its own package, that's where you can go to a company and try to get interest on, doing a second staging. But if it's something that has not been staged before, there are actually quite a few resources to figure out how to get that in front of people. But typically they would follow after a workshop model of you putting it up as a workshop of something that's not fully thought out for people to kind of see what your initial thoughts are and figure out how they can add to it.
Somebody just asked if a company agrees to produce your opera that you've written, hires the singers, puts on a full stage production, and even though they haven't commissioned you, shouldn't the writers and composers get paid something? The answer is yes, absolutely. It's called brand rights, always. They have to license the rights from you, and you should be getting royalties. If you're ever in a situation where you're not getting paid, you need to step in and get some support. So typically there is a collaboration agreement between the composer and the librettist. Again, that's something that's actually covered in that seminar that we did on writing opera and the law. And that's the agreement, or your commission, whether it's a commission agreement or if it's just a collaboration agreement between you and your composer, will outline the ratio or the proportion of how revenue is split between the writing team. right? It might be 50-50, it might be 60-40, just depends on what the nature of the relationship is. And then any revenue that comes in as a result of licensing it, you would be entitled to that split. So absolutely, just because a company doesn't commission the work doesn't mean that you wouldn't be getting revenue from that.
Larry, is this a good moment to mention what Deborah and I and D.E.E.P are all involved with, which is the Dramatists Guild Opera
Absolutely.
Committee?
Yeah, why don't
We
we
are
talk
in
a
a
little bit about that,
multi-year
Michael?
project to try and make sense of all this and offer people what are the so-called best practices so that you don't get exploited or asked to do your opera for free. We've been interviewing the whole field, and hopefully within a year's time, we will have a significant document to offer anyone who's interested that wants to sort of know the lay of the land.
It's been a bit of the Wild West out there in terms of opera libretto contracts. So yeah, the Dramatists Guild attorneys, we have been studying the contracts, and based on interviews, we're going to come up with a best practices document that will help guide librettists in negotiating their contracts. So,
But it pays to join Opera America, and it pays to join the Dramatists Guild. If you're you cannot use a contract from the Dramatists Guild to do an opera. That's strictly for theater. But there are sample contracts that other people have taken the names out of and taken the titles out of, but you can sort of see what's done. And the Dramatists Guild and probably Opera America will be able to help you find that information. These are great organizations, as is ALT, and you don't have to work in the dark. The information is there if you join these groups, go to the seminars, and learn about it.
Can I also add with the Dramatists Guild that if you join the Dramatists Guild, you also get access to having contract reviews by lawyers. And so there are some benefits to just being in part of the guild that go along with being, working with the opera committee, but just as a member, you get to be able to say, here's my contract. Is this standard? Is this fair? And have someone that has more industry knowledge be able to really chime in on that. And that was actually the first thing that drew me to the Dramatists Guild prior to the opera committee even being formed, because I was kind of working independently and I was like, I don't know what the standards are. I'm just saying that's more money than I've been paid for before, so I'll do it, right? Which is not necessarily helpful. And I found myself later looking back on quite a few of my contracts and realizing just how bad the terms were that I agreed to because I didn't know what the industry standards were.
Right. There are a lot of beginning librettists that start out and they'll accept a fee. But really, you're writing the play. You're writing the play that is getting sung. It's not a work for hire. It's not a fee. You should own your work and you should have creative say and input into that. That's why a lot of playwrights who wanted to join opera but didn't know how asked for this opera committee to be born out of the Dramatists Guild. Most of the people write plays and musicals and other things, but they are interested in writing opera, and we're providing a service to our national membership, as is Opera America.
Great. So thank you for that. And there are a lot of resources that the Dramatists Guild are offering. And I have to say the Guild has done an amazing job and continues to do an amazing job to advocate for librettists, as the opera field historically has been very skewed to composer representation and composer rights. And so it's been very exciting to see this. And Michael, you and Mark Campbell initially were a big part of that. And now, Deborah, you're the co-chair, right, of this committee. And Deborah, I didn't even realize you were a part of this as well. So this is so exciting.
But we just had our first panel from the Dramatists Guild Opera Committee at an Opera America conference.
Right.
It was very well attended, and I think that the opera world is coming around partially because people are interested in new stories.
Yeah.
And that means you need librettists. You can't keep doing La Boheme on the moon. They want new stories.
Absolutely. So as we're talking about resources, and we're going to be wrapping up very shortly, I'd love to talk about some other resources, and I will very briefly talk about what we have at ALT. Someone asked about teaching classes for librettists. So for those who aren't familiar with the Composer Librettist Development Program, it is a fairly full-time commitment. It's a fairly intensive program that is a full year.
It's full time.
It's a full time. Okay.
Just
Well, I
commit
mean,
to it.
these classes happen in general in the evenings with a couple of residency periods. It's not full time, like you can't have your job at the same time, but it is a very serious commitment. It is not just, 10 classes spread out across 10 months. It is about 250 hours of training over the course of 1 year in the first year of the program. And we are going to be opening applications for the next cohort at the end of this month. And we accept a combination of composers, librettists, and dramaturgs in the cycle. And you do not need to apply with a writing partner. This is very, very important that people understand that. Don't feel like if you don't have a collaborator, you can't apply. In fact, we don't like monogamy in the first year of the program. We joke that we want you to artistically sleep around, essentially, and collaborate with as many people as possible to get to know where there's creative spark, right, and to get to work with people who have different working styles. But it is a very structured program. There's a curriculum that we've now developed almost 20 years that the program has been in existence. And the curriculum has continued to evolve, and our faculty is continuing to grow. And actually, we'll be having some more of our alumni starting to join the faculty as well, which is really exciting. So there is information about the program on our website. It is being updated for this year for some changes to the program. But certainly anyone who is interested in really investing the time in developing their skills as a librettist, we'd love to have you apply for the program. Applications are free, but I will say it is not the program where you come to pitch your idea for an opera. This is a program which is based on process, not on a product. Right. So we don't want you to say, oh, this is the piece I want you to work on that I want to work on in the program. I have this idea for my great magnum opus. That's really not the nature of the program. This is a program for people who want to play in the sandbox of opera, to work with other composers, to develop their skills, to develop relationships that can eventually lead to commissions down the road. But it is very much a collaborative and process-oriented program. Now, ALT's program is, as Deborah emphasized, or D.E.E.P emphasized, full-time. It is an intensive program. There are other programs out there, though, and I'd love to touch on some of them. And we are putting together a resource package that we're going to be making available on the website that provides links to a number of these initiatives. ALT's was the first full-time program for composers and librettists in the country, but there are now over 40 different initiatives across the country that have come up in the past 10 years that are providing some sort of resources or training for emerging opera writers. John, you had mentioned AOI. Can you just talk a little bit about what that is? Because we did have a couple folks asking about that.
Yeah, so AOI is the American Opera Initiative that is in conjunction with the Kennedy Center and Washington National Opera. And I mean, I was there in 2015, and I know that, it's under different leadership now, and it's evolved quite a bit. But essentially, you apply and they choose 3 composers and 3 librettists, and then amongst the 6 of you, you pair up with who you think you would best fit with, and then you are mentored by a librettist mentor, a compositional mentor, and a conducting mentor. And then you compose a 20-minute opera for an ensemble of, I think, no more than 4 singers and no more than 11 players. And then it's workshopped throughout about a year. And then I think, Deborah, you were a mentor for that, aren't you?
I for the last cycle I was, yes. It's a little different now. You write a 3-character 20-minute opera.
Yeah, and then you get a I think 2 performances of it now at the Kennedy Center for an audience, and it was a incredible opportunity for me. However, I think that based on my experience, the CLDP gets more into the nuts and bolts of it. I think that at AOI, you're a little bit more on your own. So to me, if this is something that you have really never dipped your toe into that you would like to, CLDP is probably a better first step, just because you're kind of thrown to the wolves a lot in a lot of situations with AOI. And that's very exciting for a lot of folks, but sometimes it can be daunting because you're working with these professionals who really expect you to have, a lot of that structuring kind of set, or at least that was my experience.
Great.
Yeah, like the ALT program really gives you a foundation in craft. and which you really need. The AOI program, if you get accepted, it's a nationwide competition, then you're teamed up now, and you have to come up with an idea, and then your mentors sort of help you and advise you as you develop your idea. But there's not and we do classes here and there, like sessions, but it doesn't offer the ongoing instruction like the ALT program does. So
And
that's a
I
really good
also,
distinction.
yeah, can I also offer that the CLDP is going to be where you actually develop a full length work at the end of the program, which is not the same as the AOI model. The AOI model and a lot of the other models, everyone actually that I know of ends in a 20 to 30-minute piece, which I actually find to be wildly harder than a full length piece to scale yourself down to something that's smaller. Personal preference. I like all my time. I want all my minutes. And so if you're a person who's like, I want to see, I want to be able to get to a place where I'm really developing full length works, I think that CLDP is a really great choice, because a lot of these other companies really are going to produce a smaller work. And this comes from someone who has been in CLDP and has also worked in a couple of these other smaller cohorts and smaller projects, that it's just a different level of ability to invest. So, right, it's not the heart, it's not the desire, but CLDP really does, they're able to hold your hand for a longer amount of time and really help you shape what it is that you're trying to conceptualize in ways that a lot of the other organizations just can't.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dave. And we do like to think of all the artists becoming a family and having a long-term relationship with ALT. But D.E.P, you've been doing this program now in St. Louis, and you mentioned you did the Atlanta program as well. Tell a little bit about those programs, especially because these are two programs that are really investing in historically underrepresented writers as well, right?
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, so I'm currently part of the St. Louis New Works Collective. What I find, and actually I'm not even I'm part of the collective's cohort. And I say that because the New Works Collective is actually the people who pick the cohort. And that's actually what I really love about their model, is that they have community artists and community leaders that come together on a panel to select people who they feel like are artists that can work at representing something new that connects to the tissue and the pulse of their city. And so it's a different model than something like a 96-hour project with Atlanta Opera, where it's kind of like their board, their people are picking people who they feel like would be really great to work in a competitive space. Everyone is kind of fighting for the opportunity to win, the opportunity to present a 20-minute work, which feels very reductive sometimes. It feels less unifying, right? Because we're not coming in as a large cohort of people who all know that we're going to be able to present work. Now we're like kind of crabs in a barrel trying to tear each other apart to get to that one spot. And while I'm not saying that it's not valuable, it is just a harder situation to enter into and feel like your authentic voice is being heard and that you're being shaped in any way. My experience with the 96-hour project was, very drop in, create the work and leave. And we had a lot less guidance and a lot less time. I split my director with another group. Producers came in maybe once a day for 5 minutes. They just didn't have the time to give to me to really shape the work. So I think it just really depends on what you want. If you want to showcase your work and you've been in the field a little longer, maybe a 96-hour project gives you the visibility of working with a large company that can give you some real, traction around your work. Something like a St. Louis New Works Collective is going to be something that you do get a smaller work at the end of it, but for a year, you'll work closely with them to shape what that smaller work looks like. I found that they're looking for more original stories in St. Louis than a lot of other companies. A lot of other companies want adaptations. They want you to kind of fall into creating the traditional model of opera and not reshaping it into something new. CLDP and St. Louis New Works Collective, I think for me, were spaces where I felt like I could bring a new story and figure out how my voice fits there. And so, it's kind of like publishing. It's kind of like other things where you have to kind of outline what your measure of success looks like, and then find the program that you feel like will walk you to that measure of success.
Thanks so much, Steve. We just have a couple minutes left, and there are a couple of questions that I want to address about the CLDP. So the criteria to be accepted in the CLDP you do not have to have a specific background, i.e. as a playwright or as a poet or as a lyricist. And as I hope is evident that even just between D.E.E.P and Deborah, for example, they come from very different artistic backgrounds. And it was wonderful having both of them in the program and being now involved more deeply with ALT. For me, the way I think about we want people who are really excited about telling stories through opera, and wherever your background is, if that is you and you're passionate about this and you feel like you have stories to tell through opera, we want to know about you. We will be asking as part of the application process for work samples. Those work samples can be more narrative work. It can be poetry. It can be short story. Don't filter yourself out of applying. If this is something that you're excited by, we want to learn about you. So please, please, please apply. There's no cost to apply. How many people typically apply? How many people are accepted? That is not a great ratio because it is a highly intensive program. But I'll be honest about it. Last cycle, there were 232 applications and there were 8 artists accepted into the program. That was a very robust application pool. We did accept artists from around the country last year. We are going to be having a slightly different proportion of non-local to local artists this year, simply because of funding, things like that ebb and flow, as you know. But it is not limited exclusively to New York City artists. A large portion of the program is now offered virtually, but it does require some residency periods in New York City. Again, the details of that will be updated on the website very shortly. But again, if don't let the fact that you don't live in New York City preclude you from considering the program right now if it's of interest to you. Before we wrap up, I just want to thank Michael and John and D.E.E.P and Deborah for being a part of this discussion. I know we've run out of time and there's a lot more we could talk about. But really just want to thank you for your insights and again for encouraging more wonderful storytelling through opera. We look forward to seeing you at the next symposium session, which will be Pathways for Composers. We're also having a session on Pathways for Dramaturgs. We will be accepting dramaturgs into this cohort, which we don't do every year. So please keep an eye out for that as well. And the spring workshop sessions, even though, well, it's sort of spring now, the more spring workshop sessions in late April and May are about the workshopping process, best practices for workshops, preparing materials. There were a couple questions about that. We have some really wonderful special guests, including Liz Lerman, who has been a big influence at ALT. She'll be joining us for one of those sessions as well. So thank you again. Thank you to all of our supporters. And we look forward to hearing from everybody who wants to be a librettist or wants to invest more in themselves as librettists. And if you were on the registration for this, you will get the support materials with additional resources. They won't be coming up for a couple of weeks until we're done the other sessions, but they will be emailed to you. Right. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, John. Thank you, D.E.E.P. Thank you, Deborah. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks for our next session. Take care.